Natalia Mehlman Petrzela, Associate Professor of History at the New School, and author of the book Fit Nation, The Gains and Pains of America's Exercise Obsession. Natalia, thanks so much for coming on.
I'm excited to be here.
Of course. So, I find it fascinating, and beauty standards changing throughout history is not a new topic, but how rapidly women in particular changed from exerting yourself with exercise is discouraged, and it's frankly unattractive and unbecoming. And then soon, it's necessary to be considered, attractive in society, and that's driven in part by, as you write in your book, like this wave of industry in fitness. So how did things change so quickly on that front?
Yeah. So for women, there's this really kind of complicated push and pull, which is exactly what you articulate. That on the one hand, when you think about like exercise in women, there's this great triumph that like women who were told like just sit there in luxurious comfort and God forbid you get muscles or sweat, like we don't have that anymore, right? But by the same token, now we have these pressures that like, to be a lady, you should be going to spin class or doing bar and have a six pack and biceps. And so I kind of show the way that happened. And I think that it's a mixture of like some really wonderful advances that feminists and kind of women's health advocates have been at the forefront of promoting, of saying, women can run long distances and lift heavy things, and it's good for them, us, to be physically active. But on the other hand, and this is what's kind of insidious and disturbing, one of the reasons it's actually been sort of easy to sell exercise to women is because so much of the marketing is actually tied up with like, this will make you pretty, this will make you thin. Like it's normal for women to want to work on their appearance. So this isn't really about strength or sports. This is about being hot. And that's something that's actually always been really easy to sell to women in this country.
Yeah, so I mean, take us back then to like Jack LaLanne
Yeah.
and some of these exercise gurus marketing themselves to housewives, and how this really all started.
Yeah, Jack LaLanne's a major figure in here. So some of our younger listeners, viewers probably won't know who he is. So he was kind of like one of the first really important fitness influencers, definitely through media. He had a TV show called The Jack LaLanne Show. And to give you a sense, so this guy, Jack LaLanne, came out of Muscle Beach. He was a bodybuilder. And he was one of these guys who was honestly seen like with a lot of suspicion, like these men who lifted weights and like worked on their body all day. It was like, there's something wrong with you. Like you're narcissistic, you're weird. So he decides, well, no, I'm going to have this TV show where I'm not only going to exercise on TV, but I'm going to invite people to do it with me. No one wanted to fund it. They're like, nobody would ever do this. This is so weird. So he gets the money together, and his audience is homemakers, suburban homemakers, mostly white women in the 1950s. And when you watch, it's really interesting because there's something like, sort of very empowering about it. He talks about exercise being a way to feel happier and healthier. And he says like, set aside your ironing, ladies. This is time for you. And there really is that like me time aspect to like working on your body. On the other hand, if you watch like hours and hours of this, as I did, there's this kind of like dark undercurrent, which is basically like, and if you don't feel energetic, young, healthy, and combat those spreading hips, you have no one to blame but yourself. You should be exercising every day. And I think that kind of push-pull, again, is like still really with us. There's something great about exercise is me time, but it's also this other freaking thing that you have to do or you're expected to do.
I mean, I feel this personally, right? Like I try to go to the gym 3 or 4 times a week, and if I don't do that, I feel genuinely bad about myself. Like I do not feel good, and I feel a lot of guilt associated with it.
I am sorry about that. I think you are not the only one who feels that way, men or women, by the way. It took me like almost 10 years to work on this book. And every time I'd be like, oh, I'm writing a book about fitness culture, people would be like, I'm so bad. I haven't worked out. And I'm like, I'm not the police, and
right.
But I am charting the history of that expectation. And I think one of the reasons it's hard to kind of, unbraid all of the things going on there is because on the one hand, we do know exercise is really good for you. It's not surprising that you feel better when you exercise 3 to 4 times a week. Like science, people with degrees, that are not mine, have shown that that really is key to feeling good and living a longer, healthier, happier life, all the rest. On the other hand, like there is that part where it's like, well, why do you feel bad? Because you're not actually getting the physiological benefits, or because you're being kind of told all the time, like you're not a good person if you don't exercise. And so that's a lot of what I'm trying to kind of get us to think critically about in this book.
Yeah, and I mean, I think so much of that comes from the consumptive element or consumption element with exercise, which means that like what you wrote about, and I haven't really thought about the fitness industry as broadly as of course you did in your book, and you also worked in it as well. The idea that the private sector has essentially created this explosion of gyms, fitness classes, equipment, everything kind of in the private space. And that is really what is associated with fitness, specifically in the United States, as opposed to outdoor public spaces where everyone can work out together for free. I mean, what was your take on that, particularly because I know you've worked at places like Lululemon that are clearly at the center of this?
Slightly privatized part of that sector. Yeah, no, absolutely. So like there's this kind of two big picture narratives that I try to trace over more than a century. And one is how exercise went from being something considered sort of like shady and weird and suspicious and narcissistic, you know, for men and women in different ways. It was considered inappropriate, to being something that in a culture where we are so divided on basically everything, most people agree exercise is good for you. Like, I don't care who you voted for, like that's kind of a consensus position. On the other hand, what's so sad to me is exactly what you hint at there, which is that despite these moments in our history when that consensus like almost yielded like great public infrastructure for recreation, for physical education, pools, parks, all that kind of stuff, instead, it's actually a private industry that has run with that idea that exercise is good for you. It makes you a good person. It's like, integral to mental health and to, spiritual health and to community and all that. And for the most part, that's something that we're sold as a product, as opposed to something that we're guaranteed as kind of a right of humanity or citizenship. And so, part of this book is I kind of look at, I don't want to say the rise and fall, but the rise and kind of, dubious state of the physical education profession. And also like what happened to some of these policy initiatives, like in the Cold War, where the idea was introduced that fitness is part of being a good American. And there were some real problems with the assumptions of like the way that worked, but it was considered to be a public priority. We've largely lost that.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what I think maybe drives some of the resentment or pushback. Like, well, one, when Michelle Obama was saying there should be healthy eating in schools, a lot of that's just like, well, you're a Black woman. So there's resentment there, right? Like just general racism about anything she does. But also because it's not introduced to the public as a public good, providing for the fitness and nutrition of human beings. It's such a privatized space at this point that I think there's natural gatekeeping and frustration from average people. I mean, you talk about how only 20% of Americans actually fall under the category of exercising regularly and are able to use these systems. And that's because we have a sickness in this country called capitalism that keeps people out of these spaces. But like that alienating element, I think there's a connection there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the reasons that the whole exercise ethos is so appealing in our country is because it's so individualistic, right? There's this appealing mythology, everything about the myth of the self-made man and self-fashioning. What more appealing place to think that's really possible than the gym? All you need is to get outside and have some motivation and willpower. And if you don't do that, it's on you. And that is so dominant in our kind of fitness culture. So I try to say, actually, that's a really unfair assumption. And that's so disempowering and doesn't even account for why 80% of people are not, getting the recommended daily minimum of exercise. And well, the book's about fitness, it's connected to all these other aspects of inequality in our country. Like if you live in a neighborhood without tree cover, it's that much hotter to go outside and run however many days a year. If you live in a body where you're considered suspicious or vulnerable when you go out for a jog, I don't care if you have all the willpower in the world, you're going to be less likely to do that safely. Very similarly, if you even think about housing and, how long it takes you to get to work, or if you work unpredictable shift labor, like how hard is it to be able to work this into your life? And so, that's something that I really try to stay on topic with fitness, would say this is connected to so many other aspects of inequality and like more individual willpower and gumption, though, yes, you do need that, whoever you are, to get off the couch and work out. And we probably all, sometimes need that reminder. That is not the solution here or the problem.
Right. Yes. And it's become a symbol of affluence, right?
Yeah.
In the way that other, say diamonds were in the housewife era, or the right kind of dress, like, or in the pre-Jack LaLanne era before it became more mainstream.
Yeah.
Like, it's amazing how quickly it turned from an empowering branding to something that causes like general alienation, or like another sense of anxiety about not being enough.
Absolutely. And I mean, you see it like starting really in like the late 1950s with some of the early kind of chain gyms. I talk about these Tanny health spas. There's so much effort, and they're smart to realize this, that these entrepreneurs put into like selling the idea that exercise is not this like gross, weird thing that happens in basements with like big dudes pumping iron. This is about an affluent lifestyle. And they're like tropical fish tanks in the gyms. And like they all say they have like thick carpeting, which I think is disgusting, but that's supposed to be this kind of sign of luxury that goes with exercise. But, you see versions of that well into today. And to me, like, big picture, it really speaks to how we think about exercise in this country as like somewhere between labor and leisure. I think as opposed to like the diamonds or the fancy car or the expensive cocktails, like people are actually more comfortable in some ways spending a lot of money on exercise because like, well, that's work. And that shows that you are, investing in yourself and in health. And those are virtuous things. Whereas the kind of overt, conspicuous consumption of more flashy things, there are people who are into that, but there are more people who are uncomfortable with it. One moment just recently, I think that might interest like your particular audience is like one thing that I realized is like, we had the financial crash in 2008, 2009. Obviously, so many people losing their homes, foreclosures, all the rest. It's also the rise of boutique fitness in that moment, which is like the highest price point at that time. And one of the ways that I argue that I think that actually makes sense is that it's also the moment when social media really comes out and people are pressured to perform their lives all day, their consumption habits. It's no longer really tasteful to show off a lot of money and spending in fancy life if you have it, but to show off, oh, I spent, $30 on this exercise class because I care about health, or $100 on these yoga pants. That sort of is a little bit more culturally acceptable because we so sanctify the pursuit of health and fitness.
Yeah, the sanctifying part is fascinating to me. But it's just like, can you expand on that point about it becoming a consumptive performative element? Because it fitness being consumption, I don't necessarily think is a concept that might come naturally to people when they think about it.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think there's this really big turning point in the 1950s in the Cold War where, exercise had been suspicious and weird for all the reasons that we said. And then there's this sense that, well, actually, like the good life that Americans are living and that we say to the Soviet Union, like we've got all these great things. We've got suburbs and cars and TV sets and frozen food and all these things. There's some people who look at the results of that on American bodies and they're like, actually, this thing that you trumpet as an example of American strength is actually making us weak. And like Eisenhower and JFK jump right on this. JFK is like, condemning the soft American in the pages of Sports Illustrated. And they start to have this kind of promotional program to have fitness programs, recreation, physical education in schools. Like, to be a good American is to be fit. That kind of falters. Like, it's never really very well funded. The kind of pressures of the Cold War change. All these people who are actually like, what are you doing? We shouldn't be preparing like, these fit people. We should be spending on science and technology. That side of like the Cold War pressure kind of wins out. But what you have is this whole generation of entrepreneurs who are like, yeah, it makes you a good American. And it also shows that you have money to spend. And it's also almost a little bit of like, a kind of Protestant work ethic. Like, you can show off that you're working hard.
Yes.
Come spend money and do that, and come join these communities, gyms, health clubs, etc., to find like-minded people who want to work on their bodies in the same way. And so that's kind of like the general idea. And then it takes different shapes. Like, you see, this idea that like working on your body is part of like a fully actualized self, and that it's up to you, the individual, to take your health in your hands. That is so appealing across the political spectrum. And, I write about like feminists who are like, yeah, like take the power back from these doctors in white coats, Black Panthers saying versions of the same thing. And then you've got these like hardcore libertarians and people at Oral Roberts University who are like, yeah, like, it's up to you, personal responsibility. Don't wait for some government like healthcare handout. Get out there and run on the open road. And you really see that ideology with exercise at its center being something embraced across the political landscape, and thus marketed really, really effectively, especially as we get into an era of austerity politics, when a lot of funding for all kinds of public programmings, PE and otherwise, fall away. And it's really something. And it's really depressing. Like, I read all these PE journals, physical education journals, and like in the late 70s, early 80s, they're like, our time has come, for our profession. Like, this is going to be the boom moment for phys ed. And it never really happened, in part because a lot of those programs were defunded. And people who would have gone into PE, I heard again and again in my interviews, were like, actually, I can make all this money making VHS and, connecting with all these communities in other ways. Can you imagine? I would have been a phys ed teacher. And to me, that's so sad, because that's where most Americans will first encounter exercise. And it's seen as this kind of, depressing path. And I think that's unfortunate. And,
well, we don't pay our teachers enough, right? Like, it's a part of, we've commodified this space so entirely, as you lay out so well in your book, that it keeps people who might be talented in that sphere from entering into the public sector, because what is the public sector for exercise? And something that you said really reminded me of, like, when you talked about how there's the Protestant work ethic being displayed physically, if you're physically fit. It's also the fact that you're, as you also, I'm kind of reiterating, you're wealthy enough to have the time to do this. You're also wealthy enough to probably go to a boutique fitness club like Equinox or Lifetime. Or the third thing here too is, I've read about this in connection to like analyzing the Kardashians and their social, what they kind of epitomize about our culture, is that there's this new era of like beauty and fitness where displaying the work and money that goes into your body is a big part of the beauty standard, which is why when people say, oh, they look fake, that's kind of the point, because it's showing I have the money and the funds to make my face contoured in a way, through surgery, through injections, whatever, that can also display my wealth. It's almost alien or otherworldly. And that is, I think, another extension of the performance of like making, capitalism be a part of your body.
Yeah, you're so right. And it's so interesting. Like, obviously, like professional, like image people for a long time have kind of exercised, but like well into I would say the early 2000s, it was kind of like a behind the scenes thing that you did. Like, Jane Fonda didn't want to record her first VHS tape, in part because she's like, I'm a movie star and it's very vulnerable to be like working out on a VHS tape. Like, what is that? I'm paraphrasing her, but now we don't have that. It's part of the appeal to kind of show the work. And I think you're right that it like does cohere with all of, Ozempic or the injections or all of the different kinds of chemical interventions that people make and surgical ones. But I do think I haven't quite figured out the way this is going to play out now or in the future, but there's always been a real tension between like people who get their appearance like through exercise exercise, which we tend to think is like legitimate because you're like, you've got the willpower to do it, versus this quote unquote easy way out of, wearing a corset, or fashion. A lot of health, a lot of fitness proponents would say like, you don't know what really lies underneath like that, those dresses or those corsets or whatnot. And so I think there's a little bit of that discourse around the surgery, although you're right, like it does take work and money and pain to do any of it, if it's not the pain that we conventionally associate with exercise.
Yeah, and it is, in terms of like the gyms in and of themselves, it also shows how like choosing between, say, going to Equinox or Planet Fitness or Blink, which we have here in New York. I mean, that also is a moment of class stratification and class anxiety in and of itself, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, all of those places signify very different income levels. I do think it's really notable, though, that how expansive this sector is. And the fact that even, with the pandemic, like when people thought brick and mortar was dead, it is not dead. It's basically back. And we have expansion at the kind of very low end, that's Planet Fitness and Blink, and also at the very high end. Like the high end, to me, I can't believe it. The price points keep getting higher and higher and higher. Like there seems to be no ceiling as to what people are willing to do in terms of luxury and equating luxury with fitness.
Yeah. Lastly, I mean, I am curious about what you think about the personalization of some of the fitness equipment that's being used, where it's now moved from you can become a part of this club and that can be your class signifier if you're an Equinox member, to now you need to also have it in your home, and you can be, this isn't about community anymore. This is about like I mean, I know that was pandemic focused as well, but these are products that are further atomizing and making them extremely private outside of the public sphere.
Yeah, it's really hard to like say it represents one thing, the kind of home fitness trend. I think like on the one hand, yeah, there is the kind of like, it's like the hyper atomization. There's not even the kind of like unexpected conversation in the locker room or with the front desk person, or, the maybe not getting the spot that you want. Like you kind of take away that third place socializing, and you just have like, I want my playlist and my person at my time. It's like the Uberification of exercise. And I think that, yeah, that signifies all the troubling social atomization that we're talking about. On the other hand, at-home exercise has also always been a real engine of inclusivity for people who don't feel comfortable going to gyms, for people with childcare challenges, for people with a range of disabilities. Like, so I hesitate to say it just represents one thing, but one thing I do think is interesting is that for much of American history, at-home exercise devices were always sold as this is cheap and like no one will know you have it. You can hide it away. Now it's like, the Peloton is like a freaking piece of furniture that people like show off, and I think that that's interesting in terms of it not being something like you wouldn't want people to know you do, but rather something that people still kind of peacock about, even if it's at home.
Well, really fascinating read. Natalia Mehlman Petrzela, associate professor of history at the New School, author of the book called Fit Nation: The Gains and Pains of America's Exercise Obsession. We'll put a link to the book in the description everywhere you're listening to or watching this, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much, Natalia. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.